sometimes their lives, to be the best, and to avoid the dishonor of defeat. The athletes competed naked and were idolized not least for their godlike perfection of form. Their fearlessness and nerve in contests bordered on the suicidal. They competed in boxing matches of gruesome ferocity and chariot races in which few made it to the finish. For the ancient Olympians, winning was everything. Theirs were not polite and gentlemanly contests or exercises in amateur sportsmanship. The first Olympians fought for tangible rewards. Officially, winners received the symbolic olive crown, but when they returned home as conquering heroes, they were given extravagant prizes. They competed seriously and fiercely for a kind of immortality. There was no afterlife in the Greek religion, and it was only through the fame and glory that one could hope to live on, remembered in sculpture and song. To lose was devastating. There was no silver and bronze in the ancient games. The losers went back to their mothers without delight, creeping through narrow alleys, wrote Pindar, poet of the ancient games. Little remains of ancient Olympia to bring to life the festivals that took place here. These pillars once held a majestic shrine to Zeus, in whose honor the games were held. This simple field was the stadion, where the track events were held, the grassy slopes teeming with 45,000 Greeks. This tunnel once echoed with the footfalls of Olympians entering the field. Overlooking all, a winged Nike, goddess of victory, was the symbol and spirit of the Olympic Games. The origins of Olympia are almost prehistoric. Humans lived here in 2800 BC. Around 1000 BC, Olympia became a shrine to Zeus, god of thunder and lightning. The games evolved from religious rites. The first contest was a foot race to the altar of Zeus, a ritual sacrifice of energy to the god. The first recorded games took place in 776 BC. They continued every 4 years without a single interruption for the next 12 centuries. The games were held in August under a full moon. Athletes had to arrive 30 days early for a month of training and scrutiny by the Olympic judges called the Hellenodecai. If you've practiced hard for Olympia, and if you've not been lazy or done anything dishonorable, they told the athletes, then go forward with confidence. But if any of you have not trained yourselves this way, then leave us and go where you choose. For the games, Olympia would fill with visitors. 100,000 people from all ends of the ancient world camped in the fields and olive groves around the shrine. They came by sea and by land. They came from as far away as Egypt, from other parts of Africa, from Marseille in what today is France, and from Olympia on the southern coast of what would become Russia. Often they came from city-states at war with each other. The Greeks were notoriously quarrelsome. But such was the importance of the games that a truce of Zeus inscribed on a sacred discus and lasting 3 months protected all travelers to the shrine. Perhaps because it was enforced by the fearsome Spartans, the truce was seldom violated, and the most bitter enemies were able to meet and compete at Olympia in peace. The first day of the Olympics was a day of religious purification. The athletes were brought here to the Bouleuterion, the home of the priests. This rock once held a statue of Zeus with his thunderbolt in hand. Under the stern gaze of the god, as the priests sacrificed the genitals of a bull, the Olympians took an oath, the solemn oath of Zeus, to compete fairly and obey the rules. It was an intimidating moment. The penalties for foul play were severe. The statues in this row were called the Zanes, put up by disgraced athletes who tried to bribe their way to victory. Not with money, but with speed of foot and strength of body must prizes be won at Olympia, the inscriptions read. The crown sometimes came at a bloody price. First, we'll explore boxing and other deadly sports of the ancient world. Beauty and art of sport, but they were also shamelessly fascinated with the savagery and violence of competition.
The Greek word for contest is agon. Our word agony comes from that. The notion of the agon is really central to Greek culture, but particularly in athletics, where agony meant the contest itself contained pain and strife and suffering.
No sport contains more agony than boxing, which has deep roots in ancient Greece. This elegant fresco of two young boxers was painted nearly 1,000 years before the Olympics began. Boxing was added to the Olympics in 688 BC, followed by wrestling and a vicious new form of fighting called Pankration. These three events were favorites with the crowd, and because of the risk and occasional sacrifice of life, were considered especially pleasing to Zeus. The fights were held in the most sacred part of Olympia, before a 30-foot altar to Zeus made entirely from the ashes of sacrificed animals. A modern boxer would be horrified by the lack of ground rules that governed an ancient boxing match. There were no weight divisions, there were no rounds. The boxers fought without a break, without water, without a corner, and without gloves.
They wound leather straps of rawhide leather around their fists and up their arms in order to increase the violence of the blow itself. The leather would actually cut into the skin of the opponent. They would very often land a blow in the head, and there would be blood dripping all over. And they would fight on and on.
When the Romans governed the Olympics, beginning in 146 BC, the boxers inserted inch-long metal spikes between the straps.
So it was almost more like a knife fight than a boxing match. There were very short careers, and there were either people who were very successful, and then a lot of newcomers who kept getting stabbed or actually ruptured by these gloves.
The fights were held in August in the afternoon under the blazing Mediterranean sun, so that the boxers had to fight glare, dehydration, and sunstroke along with each other. Fights lasted for hours until one boxer signaled defeat, which he did by raising a single finger. But the shame of defeat was so great that many fighters took a vow to die in the ring rather than lose. Mamalos of Alexandria died here while boxing. His funeral plaque reads, "He prayed to Zeus to give him either crown or death." The Spartans, fanatically militant and trained never to quit, would not compete in the boxing ring because the disgrace of surrender was so crushing. Fighters were admired not just for the punishment they could inflict, but for the pain they could endure. One boxer, Eurydimus of Cyrene, swallowed his teeth rather than show his opponent they were broken.
They really valued philosophically and physically this notion that you could endure pain to such an extent that you would go on and on receiving blows and enduring the sun and the dust and the heat. And there were philosophical virtues behind it.
If a fight dragged on indefinitely in a stalemate of pure stamina and will, the judges would call for a climax in which the fighters traded undefended blows.
There is one famous story about two fellows who came to this point in the match, Croesus and Demosthenes. It was a face-off, and they had one blow each. The first blow was to be landed by Demosthenes, and instead of a fist, he used a karate jab and pierced, supposedly, the skin of the opponent, and reached in, gripped his entrails, and tore out his intestines. Croesus, the poor deceased, posthumously was declared victor because of a technicality. They claimed that Demosthenes had not given one blow, but 5, because he used all 5 finger points to pierce his opponent.
The ancient fighters did not have sophisticated training equipment, but they still had physiques as impressive as their modern counterparts. Boulders like this one, weighing 316 pounds, were the bodybuilding tools. A weightlifter in the 6th century named Bybon lifted this rock over his head with one hand, so the inscription declares. Boxing may have appeared to lack ground rules, but the Pankration was worse.
The Pankration was an original and very brutal event. It was the most brutal of all the ancient competitions. And some people say it was imperfect boxing combined with imperfect wrestling. You could throw punches, you could kick, you could strangle, you could break bones. Absolutely nothing was barred.
Introduced in 648 BC, the Pankration was governed by only 2 rules: no biting and no gouging. Even those were not always enforced. Conducted in the nude, blows to the genitals were frowned upon, but the rule was frequently ignored. Technique was beside the point in this ancient version of an alley fight.
Pankration, which personifies the violence of ancient sports, was the most appealing, the most popular of all events. And that may tell us something about the human spirit through the ages.
The only relatively civilized combat sport by today's standards was wrestling, although here too the rules were very relaxed.
Generally speaking, it was everything goes, and a lot of things that aren't allowed today. Again, types of strangulation, occasionally breaking bones would be allowed, and tripping was also a good technique.
Highly trained, the ancient wrestlers were well schooled in a vast number of moves: the flying mare, the hammerlock, and various body holds. The matches were held in a pit, and there were 2 forms of competition: upright or on the ground. Upright, the wrestlers maneuvered around each other on their feet. 3 throws of any kind meant defeat. Ground wrestling was a messy affair, held in a mud pit that made the fighters slippery and difficult to hold. The match continued as with boxing and Pankration until one wrestler signaled defeat. Wrestling too was violent. As early as the 7th century BC, the judges felt the need to make a rule against finger breaking. It was largely ignored. In the 5th century BC, Leontiscos of Sicily won 2 wrestling